The FBI wanted poster had been staring at Mateo Vargas from his television screen for 3 days straight, but it wasn't until the fourth morning that the face finally clicked. He was pouring coffee in his small Phoenix apartment when the news anchor repeated the name, David Martinez, armed robbery suspect, considered extremely dangerous, last seen near the Mexican border. The coffee mug slipped from Mateo's trembling hands, shattering on the kitchen floor as the terrible realization hit him like a physical blow. This was the man he'd helped cross the desert just 2 weeks ago. The desperate stranger who begged for assistance, who'd claimed his pregnant wife was dying in Los Angeles, who'd promised to pay back the kindness someday. The man Mateo had risked everything to save was now the subject of a multi-state manhunt, and somewhere in an FBI database, Mateo's own face was probably being linked to one of America's most wanted fugitives. It had started with what seemed like divine intervention on a scorching July afternoon near Bay, Arizona. Mateo had been working construction on a remote ranch, legitimate work with papers that were finally, thankfully real. After years of living in the shadows, he'd managed to adjust his status, find steady employment, build something resembling a normal life. The border was behind him now, both literally and figuratively, a chapter he'd closed forever. But the border, it seemed, wasn't finished with him. He'd been heading back to his truck after a long day laying foundation when he heard the voice calling from the brush. Weak, desperate, speaking Spanish with an accent he recognized immediately as Colombian. His Colombian. For a moment, hearing his homeland's familiar rhythms in this desolate place transported him back to his own crossing 3 years earlier, when he'd stumbled through the same desert with blistered feet and a heart full of impossible dreams. The man who emerged from the mesquite was in bad shape, dehydrated, sunburned, his clothes torn by thorns and his eyes carrying a particular brand of desperation that came from betting everything on a gamble that wasn't paying off. He claimed his name was David, said he'd been walking for 3 days after his group had been scattered by Border Patrol. His story poured out in fragments. A pregnant wife in Los Angeles, emergency surgery needed, family raising money for proper documents that wouldn't arrive in time. Everything about the encounter should have triggered warning bells. David was traveling alone, unusual for someone making their first crossing. He had no water, no supplies, yet seemed surprisingly knowledgeable about the terrain. His clothes, while dirty, were expensive underneath the desert grime. But Mateo heard only the desperation, saw only a fellow Colombian in trouble, felt only the familiar tug of solidarity that connected people who'd made the same impossible journey. The plan that formed was simple and dangerous. Mateo would drive David to Phoenix, help him get to a bus station, provide some money for the trip to Los Angeles. It meant breaking laws Mateo had sworn never to break again, risking the life he'd built so carefully. But David's story about the pregnant wife, the dying baby, the family's desperate attempts to raise money, it all felt too real, too specific to be fabricated. During the 3-hour drive to Phoenix, David had been the perfect grateful refugee. He asked about Mateo's story, nodded knowingly at the familiar struggles of documentation and employment. He spoke lovingly of his wife Maria, described the apartment they found in Los Angeles, painted pictures of the American life they'd built together. His Spanish was cultured, educated, carrying hints of wealth that made his current circumstances even more tragic. He'd paid careful attention to everything, the route they took, the addresses they passed, the details of Mateo's life that emerged through conversation. Where Mateo worked, where he lived, how long he'd been in Phoenix. At the time, it had seemed like natural curiosity, one immigrant learning from another's experience. Now, those questions took on a sinister weight. David hadn't been making conversation. He'd been gathering intelligence. At the Greyhound station, David had embraced Mateo with tears in his eyes, promising to repay the kindness once the baby was born and they were settled. He'd taken a photo with Mateo's phone, saying he wanted to remember the guardian angel who'd save his life. Then he'd walked into the station and disappeared into the stream of travelers heading north, carrying with him the secrets of Mateo's identity and location. For 2 weeks, Mateo had felt good about his decision. Despite the risks, despite the potential legal consequences, he'd done the right thing. He'd saved a life, helped a family, honored the tradition of mutual aid that kept people like them alive in hostile territory. When colleagues at work complained about immigrants taking jobs, Mateo thought about David and felt proud of his choice. The first hint that something was wrong came through construction crews' gossip network. Someone had heard from someone who knew someone that there had been questions asked about workers at their job site. Immigration? No, FBI. Someone had been looking for information about a Colombian worker who'd been seen helping someone in the desert. The details were vague, the sources unreliable, but Mateo's stomach had dropped at the news. Then came the news reports. A string of armed robberies across New Mexico and Arizona, all bearing the same signature. A Spanish-speaking man who seemed to know his victims' routines, who struck with professional precision, who disappeared like smoke before police arrived. The suspect was described as Colombian, educated, possibly undocumented. Security footage was grainy, but the height and build seemed familiar. When David's face finally appeared on television, when the anchor read the list of his alleged crimes, Mateo felt his carefully constructed world tilting off its axis. Armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, multiple victims across multiple states. This wasn't a desperate immigrant helping his pregnant wife. This was a career criminal who'd found the perfect cover story to manipulate Good Samaritans into providing assistance. The photo David had taken on Mateo's phone suddenly became evidence. The conversations they'd had about Mateo's work, his apartment, his immigration status, all of it could be used to build a case that Mateo had been an accomplice rather than a victim. How could he prove he'd been deceived? How could he explain his decision to help without appearing complicit in whatever crimes had followed? The paranoia started immediately. Every car that slowed near his apartment might be surveillance. Every conversation with co-workers might be an interrogation in disguise. Every knock on the door might be federal agents with arrest warrants. Mateo had spent years building a life where he didn't have to look over his shoulder, and now he was back to the constant vigilance of someone with everything to lose. Sleep became impossible. His dreams were filled with courtrooms and jail cells, deportation hearings and families he'd never see again. He replayed every moment of the encounter with David, looking for signs he'd missed, warnings he should have heeded, the expensive clothes, the lack of supplies, the detailed knowledge of the area, the way he'd photographed everything. All the red flags that desperation had blinded him to. Work became torture. Every time someone mentioned immigration, crime, or law enforcement, Mateo wondered if they were watching his reaction. When the crew foreman asked if anyone had been contacted by federal agents, Mateo had to fight to keep his voice steady while denying any knowledge. The lies felt like acid in his throat, but what choice did he have? The Latino community's informal communication network, usually a source of support and information, now felt like a trap. Stories circulated about David's crimes, about the manhunt, about possible accomplices being sought. Some versions of the story mentioned a construction worker who'd helped him escape. Others described a complex network of people providing assistance. Mateo listened to these rumors with growing horror, wondering which version the FBI believed. 2 weeks after seeing David's face on television, the knock on Mateo's door finally came. Not federal agents, as he'd feared, but something worse. David's victims. A family from Tucson whose home had been invaded, whose savings had been stolen, whose sense of security had been shattered. They'd somehow traced a connection between David and Mateo, had come seeking answers about the man who destroyed their lives. The confrontation was devastating. The victims weren't interested in Mateo's explanations about being deceived. They saw only another criminal, another part of the network that had enabled their trauma. Their anger was justified, their pain real, their accusations impossible to defend against. How could Mateo explain that his act of mercy had enabled their suffering? Legal advice from a community organization confirmed Mateo's worst fears. Even if he'd been genuinely deceived, his assistance to a known fugitive could still be prosecuted as accessory after the fact. The fact that he hadn't reported the encounter after seeing the news made his situation worse. Every day he remained silent, deep in his apparent complicity in David's subsequent crimes. The decision to come forward was agonizing. Confessing his involvement meant admitting to federal crimes, risking deportation, losing everything he'd built. But staying silent meant living with the knowledge that his help had enabled more victims, more suffering, more families destroyed by the man he'd thought he was saving. The FBI interview took place in a sterile federal building where Mateo's dreams of American stability went to die. The agents were professional but skeptical, treating his story of deception as a convenient excuse for criminal assistance. They showed him surveillance photos from David's subsequent crimes, asked pointed questions about his motivations, demanded details about his decision-making process. The polygraph test was humiliating, strapped to machines that measured his stress responses while recounting the most shameful mistake of his life. The agents watched the readouts carefully, looking for signs of deception in his claims of innocence. Even though he passed, even though the machines confirmed his truthfulness, the experience left him feeling violated and exposed. David's capture, when it finally came, brought no relief. The news showed him being led away in handcuffs from a motel in Nevada. His crime spree ended by an alert desk clerk who'd recognize his face. But his arrest only intensified the investigation into his support network, the web of people who'd helped him evade capture for so long. The evidence against Mateo was circumstantial but damning. The photo on his phone, the gas station receipts from their trip to Phoenix, the testimony of witnesses who'd seen them together. Even his eventual cooperation with investigators couldn't erase the fact that he provided material assistance to a fugitive, regardless of his intentions. The plea agreement was brutal but necessary. Probation instead of prison, community service instead of deportation, but his immigration status will remain precarious for years. Every interaction with law enforcement would be scrutinized. Every background check would reveal his connection to David's crimes. The American dream he'd worked so hard to achieve had been tainted by one act of misplaced compassion. David, faced with overwhelming evidence, eventually confessed to his crimes. During his testimony, he expressed no remorse for deceiving Mateo, describing the manipulation as a necessary part of his criminal enterprise. Good Samaritans were useful tools, he explained, their desire to help making them easy to exploit. The casual cruelty of his words revealed the depth of Mateo's naivety. The victim's impact statements were harder to bear than any legal punishment. Family after family described how David's crimes had shattered their sense of security, how they no longer felt safe in their own homes. Knowing that his assistance had enabled their suffering was a weight Mateo would carry forever. In the end, David received multiple life sentences, ensuring he'd never again exploit someone's compassion for criminal purposes. But for Mateo, the punishment continued daily. Co-workers who learned of his involvement treated him with suspicion. Immigration attorneys warned that any future violations could trigger his deportation. The life he'd built so carefully remained forever fragile. The construction job he loved became impossible to maintain under the constant scrutiny. Background checks revealed his connection to federal crimes, making him unemployable in any position requiring security clearance. He found work in restaurants and warehouses, places that didn't ask too many questions but offered no path to advancement. The Colombian community's reaction was mixed. Some understood the impossible position he'd been placed in, the way desperation could cloud judgment and lead to tragic mistakes. Others saw him as a cautionary tale, proof that helping the wrong person could destroy the helper's life as thoroughly as the victim's. The solidarity that had once connected them to shared struggles now carried undertones of suspicion and fear. Sleep remained elusive years after David's capture. Mateo would wake in cold sweats, remembering the moment he decided to help, replaying the conversation that had led to such devastating consequences. The what-ifs tormented him. What if he called Border Patrol instead? What if he demanded more proof of David's story? What if he'd simply driven away and left the problem for someone else? Dating became impossible. How could he explain to potential partners that his compassion had made him an accessory to multiple felonies? How could he trust his own judgment about people when he'd been so thoroughly deceived? The isolation deepened his regret, creating a cycle of self-doubt and recrimination that therapy couldn't fully address. The news reports about David's trial brought unwanted attention to Mateo's role in the case. Local media described him as an accomplice, a co-conspirator, a criminal who'd escaped justice through cooperation. The nuance of his deception was lost in headlines that painted him as part of the problem rather than another victim of David's manipulation. 5 years later, Mateo still lived in Phoenix, still worked in jobs below his capabilities, still carried the weight of a single decision that had changed everything. The American dream hadn't died completely, but it had been permanently scarred by the knowledge that compassion itself could be weaponized against the compassionate. He'd learned to recognize the signs he'd missed with David. The expensive clothes, the overly detailed backstory, the lack of proper supplies for desert crossing. Other immigrants sought his advice about suspicious encounters, and he shared his hard-won wisdom about the predators who lurked among the desperate. His mistake had become a lesson for others navigating the treacherous landscape of border crossing. The irony wasn't lost on him that his greatest act of mercy had led to his greatest regret. He'd tried to save a life and instead had enabled the destruction of multiple lives. The road to hell, as the saying went, was paved with good intentions. David had exploited not just Mateo's compassion, but the entire tradition of mutual aid that kept vulnerable people alive in hostile environments. Sometimes, watching the news coverage of new immigration crises, Mateo wondered how many other David Martinezes were out there, using legitimate desperation as cover for illegitimate purposes. How many good people were being manipulated into becoming unwitting accomplices? How many acts of mercy were being perverted into instruments of harm? The construction sites where he'd once worked with pride now served as reminders of what he'd lost. Driving past them, he'd remember the sense of accomplishment he'd felt, the belief that he was building not just structures but a future. That future had been stolen by a stranger with convincing story and dead eyes that he'd been too naive to see. His family in Colombia knew only part of the story, that he'd gotten into legal trouble trying to help someone, that his immigration status was complicated, that he couldn't visit home for foreseeable future. The full details were too shameful to share, too complex to explain. How could he tell them that their son's compassion had nearly destroyed the very life they'd sacrificed to help him build? The FBI had closed David's case, but they'd never closed the book on potential accomplices. Mateo remained on various watch lists, his name flagged in systems that ensured he'd never fully escape the consequences of that July afternoon. Every airport, every background check, every interaction with authority carried the weight of his connection to a violent criminal. But perhaps the heaviest burden was the knowledge of what he'd enabled. Somewhere in Arizona and New Mexico, families still dealt with the trauma David had inflicted. Children still had nightmares about the man who'd invaded their homes. Parents still struggled with the financial losses that had devastated their savings. All of it made possible, in part, by a construction worker who tried to do the right thing. The desert where he'd first encountered David had been developed into a shopping center, the mesquite and thorns replaced by concrete and commerce. But Mateo could still see it as it had been, vast, unforgiving, full of people making desperate gambles with their lives. He'd been one of those people once, and he'd survived to help another. That the other had been a predator rather than a refugee was a lesson written in scars across his rebuilt life. The stranger he'd thought he was saving had saved nothing but his own criminal enterprise. The mercy Mateo had shown had been met with manipulation, so thorough it had nearly destroyed him. But he continued to live in the country David had used as his hunting ground, building what he could from the wreckage of good intentions gone wrong. Years had passed, but the television screen still held the power to stop his heart when familiar faces appeared on the news. Every manhunt, every fugitive, every wanted poster carried the possibility of recognition, of connections, of new chapters in a story he thought was finished. The border between helper and accomplice, between mercy and crime, had proven thinner than he'd ever imagined. David Martinez remained in federal prison, his crimes cataloged and punished, his victims compensated as much as the law allowed. But his greatest crime, the theft of trust itself, the poisoning of compassion, continued to echo through the lives of everyone he'd touched. Mateo carried that poison still, careful now of strangers in distress, wary of stories that tugged too hard at heartstrings that had already been broken once. The man he thought he was helping had been real enough, flesh and blood, sweat and desperation, speaking his language and sharing his heritage. But the person inside that man, the predator wearing the mask of the desperate, had been something else entirely. And in the desert of moral choices, where mercy and foolishness grew side by side like cactus flowers, Mateo had picked the wrong bloom and tasted only thorns.